Lecture 6, From Persephone's Land to the Island of Helios.
Hello, and welcome back to Lecture 6. In the previous lecture, we went from the island of Aeolus through Odysseus' encounter with Circe into Odysseus' visit to the land of the dead. In this lecture, we, like Odysseus, resume his narrative of his conversations with the ghosts of the dead and follow his story through to the loss of his remaining companions and his arrival on Calypso's island. At Alcinous' request, Odysseus resumes his narrative of the ghosts he spoke to in the underworld, with descriptions of encounters with several of his companions from the Trojan War. Specifically, he speaks of meeting Agamemnon, Achilles, and Aias the Greater, and speaking to each of them. He then describes an encounter with the ghost of Heracles, and brings Nequia to a rather abrupt and surprising ending. As Odysseus resumes his story, he talks first about his encounters with Agamemnon, Achilles, and Aias. Agamemnon, like Elpenor and Odysseus' own mother Anticlea, is another dead soul that Odysseus meets whom he had not known was dead. We, of course, as the audience, know perfectly well that Agamemnon is dead, and this has been mentioned over and over again from the very beginning of the Odyssey. But up until this point, Odysseus had no way to know that. And so his first reaction upon seeing Agamemnon is grief and wonder at how Agamemnon died. He asks him, "Were you drowned at sea? Did you encounter enemies who killed you?" And Agamemnon tells Odysseus the story, which, again, we, the audience, have heard several times already at this point, of Agamemnon's murder at the hands of his treacherous wife Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus. So at this point, Odysseus is given this comparison to contemplate between his own situation vis-a-vis Penelope and Agamemnon's situation vis-a-vis Clytemnestra. And lest the implication be too subtle, Agamemnon specifically says to Odysseus, "Do not trust even Penelope." He says, "There's no trust in women. When you get home, be very, very careful, because you cannot tell what may have happened in the time that you were away." So now Odysseus has heard from Tiresias, the prophet whom he consulted at the beginning of the Nequia. He has heard that if he and his companions harm the sun god's cattle, he will arrive home to find troubles in his household, specifically suitors courting Penelope. Agamemnon's ghost has now told him that these things do in fact happen in real life, and that the consequences can be devastating. In Agamemnon's case, Clytemnestra's treachery cost him his life. So Odysseus has good reason to be concerned now. He's had this double warning about Penelope and what may be happening on Ithaca. And it's important for us, as the audience of the epic, to remember that the 7 years' captivity on Calypso's island take place after Odysseus' trip to the underworld in the time frame of his story. We, of course, hear about Calypso first and then hear about the great wanderings. But remember, Odysseus is narrating in flashback. All of this, the trip to the underworld, everything else happened before he arrived on Calypso's island. So those 7 years when he's sitting there looking out over the water every day, yearning to go home, part of what's motivating that is precisely these warnings that he received from Tiresias and Agamemnon about what might be happening on Ithaca in his absence. His desperation to go home, his absolute fixated desire to go home, is in part motivated by his fear of what he might find if he gets there too late. After talking to Agamemnon, who asks Odysseus for news of his son Orestes, and of course Odysseus can't give him any news because Odysseus, hasn't been back home yet. After talking to Agamemnon, Odysseus next talks to the ghost of Achilles. He describes to Achilles the great funeral that the Greeks gave Achilles, a funeral that of course does not remain in any surviving epic, but was recounted in one of the lost epics, as I mentioned in the first lecture on the Odyssey. Achilles responds to this recounting of his own funeral by telling Odysseus that there's no point in trying to comfort him for having died. And he says that he would prefer to be the slave of a poor man than to be king over all the perished dead. Now, this is a very remarkable thing for Achilles to say, because it seems to flatly contradict the choice that Achilles made in the Iliad, where he was told by his mother, the goddess Thetis, that he had a choice of two fates: to fight and die gloriously at Troy and have a short life, but everlasting fame, undying Kleos, or to live a long and uneventful life and leave no fame behind him, but die a very old man. In the Iliad, Achilles chose the short and glorious life with the undying reputation to live after him. Now, in the Odyssey, his ghost says, "I would rather be a poor man's slave," which is as wretched an existence as can be imagined. "I would rather be a poor man's slave than be king over all the dead." Is Achilles' character being inconsistent here? I'm not sure. Some people think yes, that this is simply an inconsistency, that the Iliad and the Odyssey disagree here. I think there might be another way of looking at it. I think perhaps one thing that's going on here is that, again, as I've talked about before, Kleos is a compensation for death in the minds of the living. The living see Kleos as a kind of immortality. The living see Kleos as meaning that they will in some sense continue after they are dead, but apparently for the dead it's meaningless. In other words, glory, fame, reputation only has any value in the world of the living, where it is the living who repeat glory, fame, and reputation about someone already dead. The dead Achilles finds no comfort in that, though the living Achilles might have found comfort in contemplating it before his own death. Another way of looking at Achilles' statement here is that this is Achilles still being Achilles, as we saw him in the Iliad torn between his two sides, between his mortal side inherited from his father, his divine side inherited from his goddess mother, as we saw him balancing those two fates, saying at one point that he would choose to go home and live the long and glorious life, at another point that he would choose to die gloriously. There seems to have been a sense in which Achilles was torn between these two choices in the Iliad. Perhaps he's now, even after death, still torn, thinking that he made the wrong choice, whichever one it was. After speaking to Achilles, Odysseus moves on to talk to the ghost of Aias the Greater. Now, Aias, you'll remember, committed suicide when the armor of Achilles was awarded to Odysseus and not to him. Odysseus, when he sees Aias' ghost in the underworld, speaks to him very humbly, very respectfully, says that he, Odysseus, wishes he had never even seen the armor of Achilles, that that armor was in no way worth the loss of so brave a companion as Aias, and yet Aias will not speak to him. Aias simply walks past him without uttering a word. This is a scene that has resonated throughout a great deal of later literature, most noticeably perhaps the encounter of Aeneas and the queen Dido, who committed suicide for love of him in Virgil's Aeneid. Aias will not speak, but remains angry and passes on by Odysseus. At some point, Odysseus seems to have moved from standing outside the underworld, standing on Persephone's land and letting the ghosts of the dead come up to him, because at this point in the narrative, he starts speaking as though he's actually in Hades. He starts describing seeing ghosts, seeing spirits inside the underworld as though he himself is inside the underworld looking at them. He mentions some famous criminals who are being tormented in the underworld. Now, by and large, Homer's picture of the afterlife includes no punishment for sinners and no reward for the good. Basically, the overall picture of the afterlife is that everybody lives this kind of, or everybody maintains this kind of bleak, pointless existence where they flitter around witless and mindless and don't even know themselves until someone gives them blood to drink. But alongside that picture, there's the idea that there are a few, sometimes called canonical criminals, a few really, really major wrongdoers who are punished with eternal torment in the underworld. Odysseus mentions seeing some of these. Perhaps the most famous one he mentions is Tantalus, Agamemnon's grandfather, as it happens, who tried to steal immortality from the gods by stealing nectar and ambrosia. He is punished by standing up to his chin in a river of water with fruit trees blowing just over his head. He's eternally hungry and eternally thirsty. But when he tries to drink, the water flows away and leaves a dry riverbed. When he tries to pluck a piece of fruit to eat, the wind blows it out of his grasp. So within sight and smell of food and drink, Tantalus is eternally hungry and thirsty. Odysseus sees him, sees several other criminals being punished with equally fiendish torments. And then he says that he sees and speaks to the ghost of Heracles. This is Odysseus' last encounter in the Nequia. Heracles, interestingly enough, doesn't need to drink the blood. Just as Tiresias recognized Odysseus without drinking the blood, so apparently does Heracles. Heracles speaks to Odysseus and greets him as, in some sense, a peer, almost an equal. He looks at Odysseus and he recognizes him, calls him by name, and says, "Then you too are suffering the kinds of troubles and pains that I also suffered when I was alive." Almost saying to Odysseus, "You are like me. Odysseus, you too are suffering what I suffered." This conversation with Heracles is Odysseus' last conversation in the Nequia. Immediately after this, he says that he was suddenly overcome with fear that the dead might overwhelm him, and he ran, he left, he set sail again for Circe's island. Now, I think the effect on Odysseus' Phaeacian audience is crucial to consider here, particularly with what the mention of Heracles is doing in the story. Odysseus presents himself not just as someone who has returned alive from Hades. That's pretty remarkable in and of itself. But there's more than that. He presents himself as someone who has returned alive from Hades, someone whom seers like Tiresias and divinities like Circe speak to as an equal almost, or as someone they are interested in. And he presents himself as someone whom the great Heracles himself greets as a peer. This last conversation, when Heracles says, "Odysseus, son of Laertes, you are suffering the same kinds of things I suffered," that is a rhetorical tour de force. Heracles was the hero to end all heroes, the great hero of Greek culture. And for Odysseus to say in the Phaeacians' hearing, "Heracles spoke to me almost as a brother, almost as an equal," that has got to have an enormous effect on his audience. And this leads to a point that's important to consider throughout Odysseus' narrative of his wanderings, throughout books 9 through 12 of the Odyssey. At this point of the Odyssey, we have only Odysseus' word for the truth of any of these adventures. We don't have what we usually have in the rest of the Odyssey, the poet speaking in that presumed omniscient voice in which if the poet says something is true, we assume it is true. In this section of the Odyssey, the poet is quoting Odysseus. As we'll see later in the books when Odysseus is back on Ithaca, Odysseus is a very gifted liar. On Ithaca, he lies almost in preference to telling the truth, and he lies very, very well. Now, some scholars go so far as to suggest that all of Odysseus' narrative of the great wanderings is one big lie, that none of this ever happened. I'm not quite that nihilistic about the Odyssey. I don't think we can go that far. For one thing, some of the adventures, the blinding of Polyphemus, the killing of the sun god's cattle, which I'll get to later in this lecture, those are vouched for by the narrator elsewhere in the epic. But it is worth considering that Odysseus, as always, is crafting his narrative to appeal to his audience. He's choosing to foreground those points that make him look best and put into the background those points that make him look worst. He is carefully, always in this section, trying to persuade the Phaeacians to help him, to give him gifts, to honor him, and to remember his story and tell it to others so as to perpetuate his kleos. So I don't think we have to go so far as to assume that he's flat out lying when he says that Heracles greeted him this way. I do think it's worth considering why he chooses to foreground that episode and perhaps to put some others into the background. Another point that's worth considering is that Odysseus, when he shapes his narrative to appeal to his audience, is doing exactly what the bard does in performance, what any bard or any storyteller does in performance. He's bringing out the details that he thinks his audience wants to hear and pushing into the background the ones that they don't want to hear, as Homer is doing for us in the Odyssey. Remember the opening of the Odyssey when Homer says to the muse, "Start the story at some point." The implication being that the muse could start the story anywhere she wanted to, i.e. that Homer could start the story anywhere he wanted to. In another version of the Odyssey, the Nequia might have been pushed way into the background, and another episode that we hear only very much in passing, say the Laestrygones, who destroy 11 of Odysseus' 12 ships, could have been pushed into the foreground. The bard crafts his story. The bard gives more attention to some episodes, less to others, depending on what the particular audience wants to hear. Odysseus, in this section of the Odyssey, is acting as the bard. The bard is acting Odysseus. Odysseus is acting the bard. A very nice complementary picture there. The whole Nequia, getting back to its function within the narrative, the whole Nequia interweaves news for Odysseus with reminders of his past. Through this journey to the underworld, Odysseus sees reminders of his past and receives news of his future. The warnings about Penelope, the warnings about what might be happening on Ithaca, the news that his mother is dead, that his father has retired to the country, the sight of Agamemnon and Achilles. In this whole section of the Odyssey, Odysseus is both looking back to his past and looking forward to his future, but unable to access either of them. In a very real sense, then, he is in a kind of limbo. He is neither dead, he's not really there with Agamemnon, Achilles, and Aias, but neither is he alive. He's not with his family. And so his position as a living man in the land of the dead very clearly reflects his position in the world itself at this point. He is neither one nor the other. He's not united with the members of his past, nor at home with his family as he hopes to be in the future. He moves on after the Nequia. We're still in his narrative of his wanderings. He moves on to describe the loss of the rest of his companions when they do indeed kill the cattle of the sun god Helios, and his arrival on Calypso's island. As we move into the sun god's cattle episode, Odysseus tells us that after leaving Persephone's land, after setting sail from the land where he spoke to the souls of the dead, he does indeed go back to Circe's island and bury the body of his comrade Elpenor, as Elpenor's ghost had asked him to do. Circe greets Odysseus and his comrades as twice dying men. She refers to them as twice dying men, since they have been to Hades and returned. This fits in nicely with that psychological interpretation that I spoke of earlier about the Nequia, in which you can see it as a kind of death of Odysseus and rebirth. Circe herself greets him as someone who must die twice. He's died once by going to the underworld. He's going to have to die again when he actually dies and returns there. After burying Elpenor, Odysseus gets advice from Circe about the dangers he will encounter next. She tells him several things he has to do between leaving her island and getting home to Ithaca. He must sail past the Sirens. These are females who sit on rocks and sing absolutely irresistibly beautiful songs to any sailors who sail past them. The Sirens entice men, they lure sailors onto their rocks. The sailors crash their ships and die. So the Sirens are as threatening as any female entity in the Odyssey that Odysseus is going to encounter. Their song is absolutely irresistibly enticing, but obeying it, listening to their song, equates death for the mariners who sail past them. Circe tells Odysseus if he wants to hear the Sirens' song and live, what he must do is stop all his companions' ears with beeswax so that they can't hear the Sirens, then have his companions tie him to the mast so that as they sail past the Sirens, he can hear the song but will be unable to respond to it. This, of course, is what he does, so he becomes one of the only living men ever to hear the Sirens' song and survive. Yet another moment that would undoubtedly give his Phaeacian audience shivers to think about, that this is someone who heard the Sirens and lived. After passing the Sirens, Odysseus must navigate his way between the so-called Symplegades, a word that means the clashing rocks. Huge rocks that clash together and then bound apart, clash together and bound apart. And what a ship has to do to survive them is time its sailing through perfectly so that it goes through when the rocks are farthest apart rather than when they clash together. Now, it has been suggested that the Symplegades represent a very exaggerated mariner's tale of icebergs, which I think is a very interesting possibility. Huge rock-like floating things in the ocean that sometimes crash into one another, sometimes crash into ships, other times don't. This is a point at which I can say a little bit about the whole question of whether Odysseus's wanderings represent any kind of reality or not. There have been all sorts of attempts to map out Odysseus's journey on the map of the Mediterranean. Where is Calypso's island? Where is Circe's island? So forth. I think most of that is useless. I agree with the ancient critic who said that trying to find where the island of Calypso was is as foolish as trying to find the cobbler who made the bag in which Aeolus tied up the winds. It's not something that has any actuality at all. And yet it is possible that some of Odysseus's adventures represent garbled, misunderstood, exaggerated reports that had worked their way back from sailors who had sailed maybe even out past the Straits of Gibraltar and back into the Mediterranean again. The possibility that the Symplegades represent icebergs, I think, is not by any means too far-fetched. The possibility that other adventures Odysseus has may in some way represent some realities somewhere, I think, is not necessarily far-fetched. But trying to map out his journey exactly and say the Cyclops Island is Sicily, although the Sicilians like to say that because it's good for selling tourist trinkets, but to try to say that the Cyclops Island is Sicily, that the Phaeacians Island is Corfu, I think that is wasted effort. After passing through the Symplegades, Odysseus must navigate his way between the monster Scylla and the whirlpool Charybdis, which of course has become proverbial for being caught between two great dangers, to navigate or to sail between Scylla and Charybdis. Scylla is a six-headed monster, cannibalistic. If Odysseus sails too close to her, she'll eat 6 of his men. Charybdis, however, is a whirlpool that will destroy his entire ship. Circe recommends that he sail a little closer to Scylla and give a wider berth to Charybdis, and that is in fact what he does. Circe then repeats Tiresias's warning about not harming the cattle of Helios if Odysseus and his men come to the island Thrinacia. Now, Odysseus follows Circe's advice. He narrates his journey through all the dangers Circe enumerates. Scylla does indeed eat 6 of Odysseus's men, but he makes it through the pass between Scylla and Charybdis without losing his entire ship. And he comes in due course to Thrinacia, the island where the sun god pastures his cattle. Odysseus wants to sail past this island without stopping, but Eurylochus, his second in command, the same man who led the group of half of Odysseus's companions to check out Circe's palace, Eurylochus persuades Odysseus to let them stop for a night. The men are tired. They want to sleep on dry land. They want to cook a meal out of the provisions that Circe has given them. They don't want to sail at night, which is very dangerous. Odysseus, against his better judgment, relents, but makes the men promise that they will not harm any cattle or sheep they find on the island. He tells them about Tiresias and Circe's warnings and extracts a promise, an oath from the men that they will not harm the cattle. Of course they promise. This should not be a problem. They're only planning to stop for one night. But once they have stopped on Thrinacia, the winds blow against them for an entire month so that they cannot leave. They eat their way through the provisions Circe had given them, and they're starving. As they are starving, finally, Eurylochus and the other companions sacrifice and eat some of Helios' cattle. Now, at this point, Odysseus carefully phrases what happened in a way that absolves him from any blame. He says that he had gone off to pray to the gods for help in getting off Thrinacia, and the gods had sent sleep to overcome him, so that he was asleep when Eurylochus and the other men decided to sacrifice and eat the cattle. This is reminiscent of Odysseus saying that he was asleep when the men loosed the winds out of the bag that Aeolus had given him, so that in both cases, when disaster strikes, Odysseus is asleep and cannot be held responsible for it. Eurylochus and the other men sacrifice the cattle reverently. They promise the sun god Helios that if they ever make it back to Ithaca, they will build him a great temple, and they start to eat the meat. And in a lovely, vivid little detail, Odysseus wakes up to the smell of roasting meat and realizes what has happened. He does not eat His men do, but Odysseus does not. And yet the fact that this is going to be disastrous becomes obvious right away. The meat keeps lowing on the spits. The hides crawl on the ground. These cattle were immortal, and in some sense, even once they have been killed, they're still immortal. It's a very eerie scene. The winds change once the cattle are dead, and the ship sets sail. But at Helios' request, Zeus sends a thunderbolt and a storm to wreck the ship, and only Odysseus escapes alive. Now, once again, Odysseus includes details that stress his blamelessness in the disaster. His men were not lost because of he had poor skills in piloting. His men were not lost because of anything he did. This was a direct intervention of the gods. And one point that I always like to bring out here is how marvelously and utterly in control of his narrative the bard, Homer, is at this point. In epic, in the Iliad and the Odyssey both, we're very accustomed to the bard, to Homer, telling us what the gods say to one another, what goes on Mount Olympus, the conversations the gods have. I don't think it would occur to one reader out of 100 if Odysseus simply said in passing, Helios asked Zeus to destroy my companions, and Zeus did so. I don't think it would occur to one reader out of 100 to stop and say, wait a minute, how could Odysseus know what Helios said to Zeus? But it occurred to Homer that 1 in 100 might wonder, and he tells us, he has Odysseus tell us how Odysseus can know what Helios said to Zeus. Odysseus tells that Helios said to Zeus, if you don't punish Odysseus's companions, I will go down to Hades and shine on the dead men. In other words, I'll leave the world in darkness, and therefore Zeus punishes Odysseus's men. And Odysseus says, I know this because Calypso told me, and she said that she heard it from Hermes. Now just pause for a moment to admire the levels of narrative here. Homer tells us that Odysseus tells the Phaeacians that that Hermes told Calypso that Helios had told Zeus to smash Odysseus' ship. We are levels and levels deep in narrative here, and who told what to whom. And yet it all works out. It's almost like an ancient analog of a footnote, that we are told how it is Odysseus can know. Footnote C, Hermes told Calypso. So Odysseus' last ship is smashed on the open sea. All of his men drown. The storm blows the ship back to Charybdis, which is where it is smashed. All of his men drown. Odysseus barely escapes with his life and then floats on some wrecked timbers to Calypso's island, where Calypso rescues him. Thus, as Book 5 ends, Odysseus' first-person narrative ends with it. As Book 12 ends, Odysseus' first-person narrative ends with it, with his arrival on Ogygia, Calypso's island. We've circled back to where we were in Book 5, halfway through the Odyssey, and indeed where we were in Book 1, at the very beginning of the Odyssey. Odysseus has told us how he came to Calypso's island, how he happened to lose all his companions, what it was that brought him to the Phaeacians in the state that he was in, and we're now ready for another beginning, this time on Ithaca itself. And in our next lecture, we'll see that the Phaeacians give Odysseus a marvelous ship that takes him back to Ithaca. They set him down on his island of Ithaca, and we begin the second half of the Odyssey with Odysseus trying to figure out how to reestablish himself on his home island of Ithaca.